I'm Shannon from houseimprovements.com, and in my video today I want to show you how I sand and refinish hardwood flooring. So for the bulk of the floor we're going to use a large pad sander like this. There are other options out there, drum sanders, those sorts of things, so depending on the severity of the condition of your floor you may have to go to a drum sander. In my case this pad sander is going to do the job. Basically, to start out you want to get as much out of the room as you can. Put up some barricades or whatever to control the dust, because you're going to have some dust. Some of these sanders will have a bag or a vacuum attachment. This one doesn't. But it's always a good idea to put up some dust screens anyways. So I did all that. We basically have everything out of the room. I've actually sanded most of this room already. We just have a little, I don't know, 3 foot by 5 foot area here that isn't done. And we're going to go through the process of showing you how to do it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use an orbital sander like this. This one I've got about 60 grit on it, and I'm going to go around the perimeter of the room, or what's left here to do, and I'm just going to get right up against the wall, any obstacles, those sort of things that I need to get tight up against that I can't with this machine. You could rent an edger if you wanted to. For what I was doing, the combination of these two sanders is basically going to do it. If you've got some big lumps of old varnish or paint or anything like that, a scraper, just a simple paint scraper like this, you can go around and get those chunks off pretty quick. And if you really needed to, you could use this in a corner to scrape the finish off too, if you can't get right in there with the sander. Another helpful thing that could be helpful is more of a detail sander that has like the triangular pad on it, and that'll get you right in tight around anything you have to get in a corner around. So basic idea, and I'll show you more when we get to this sander, is we're going to use a variety of grits of sandpaper. The first ones are going to be really coarse. I think I've got a 20 grit and a 36 grit for my initial sanding, and that's just to get that old finish, that old grime off. And you'll use quite a few of those pads. I don't know, on about say 100 square feet, you're probably gonna, on this machine, you're probably gonna use 4 or 5 pads in those lower grits just to get that finish off, because they're gonna gum up fairly quickly. So I'm using 20 grit. What are they? 36, 60, 80, and 100, I believe, are my grits. So we'll just go finer and finer every time we sand, just to each change of the paper basically sands out the scratches from the previous one, and gets you a nice smooth finish. Okay, so yeah, so get all your stuff out of the way. Go around, set any nails or anything like that might be sticking out of the floor. Fill in any little holes or cracks or big nicks that you obviously can't sand right down through, and then you're ready to go. You're probably going to want some like a dust mask and that sort of thing, maybe some ear protection if you like. You probably really don't need eye protection, but that's up to you. So we're going to reposition the camera, and I've got a little bit to do around the edges here with this orbital, and then we'll get to the big guy. Okay, so like I said, I've just got a basic orbital sander like you might already own, and I'm going to do the perimeter, and it's just because you can't get right up close sometimes with some of these machines. And in the case of this machine, really, I'm only going to do this once, just the initial pass to get the finish off itself. After that, I can get close enough with this one to actually sand scratches and that sort of thing out. So I've got 60 grit on here. If you had a 50 grit or something, would be probably even a little better. So I'll make this pass with the orbital, and then that's probably the only time I'll need it. So. And I guess if you've got a difficult spot to get in, you might still need yours after this, but I don't here. So. Okay, so I did the edges there. In between sanding, you want to either sweep up or preferably vacuum up your dust, so you aren't grinding that into the next pass or whatever when you're sanding away. So I'm just going to quickly vacuum this up. And then we'll get the sanding pad on the sander, and then we'll start that process. So because I've got such a small area here, it's going to be kind of quick going through this, and I'll be changing pads quite often. But with this style of sander, it's going to come with a I don't know what you call this, kind of a sponge kind of deal. So you want to stick your sanding paper onto one side of that sponge. And we're starting with our coarsest grit, remember? So just set it on the sponge, turn that over. I'm going to set the sander onto that pad. Just roughly kind of centered up on there. And then this sander, a lot of these style are kind of the same. I'm just going to turn this around for a minute so you can see. So obviously it's electric, but there's also a safety right here. Little safety button that you're going to have to push before you squeeze the triggers, or it won't work. I'm sure at the rental shops they get a lot of people phoning thinking their sander doesn't work, but they don't know about the safety. So, and also most of them will have some kind of adjustment on the handle for storage and whatever, so just kind of put it where you want it. Okay, so set your sander on the pad, and then with this type of sander you're going to start up with the pad on the ground. When you go to stop sanding, you just want to push down on the handle, which lifts the pad up off the ground. So what else can I tell you before I start this thing? So I'm just going to be basically making my way around the perimeter and back and forth over this area, and I'm just trying to get as much of the finish off as I can. If I notice that it's not working as well anymore, then that's a good sign that I need to change my pad, because they will get gummed up like I said before. Yeah, I think that's about it. So. Okay, so as you noticed, I was kind of moving any direction, and with this type of sander you can do that. With a drum sander you generally want to go with the grain, with the length of the boards, just so you aren't getting scratches across the grain. If your floor was in really rough shape though, really up and down, you would probably go diagonally on your first pass even with the drum sander, but after that you'd go with the grain. This one, it doesn't really matter. You're trying to get down so that all the finish is gone. And I can see, I don't know if you'll be able to tell here on the camera, but it's getting pretty good here, but there's a little low spot in some of these joints, and they're still finished there. If you're not going to stain or change the color of your floor, a little bit of that will generally be all right. But if you're staining, you for sure want to get right down to bare wood. I've got a little bit of a wobble here in the floor up against the wall. I'm going to change to a new pad again. I'm going to give this another pass just to try to flatten this out and get down into these grooves a bit better, but it's getting real close. So this change, I'm just going to put another pad on at the 20 grit.
And I'm not going to worry about vacuuming up in between this when I'm just staying in the same grid of paper. Okay, so that should be good for that grit, and I'm going to change to a little bit finer, which I think is 36 or 35 or something, and once I vacuum this dust up, I will do a pass or two with that. If you notice when I'm making a pass and I'm moving over, I'm not moving over the full width of the machine, I'm going about a third of the machine over and making my passes, and I'm going fairly slow. Something else I'll mention, if you're doing this and it's winter time, or even in the summer, I guess it stands to reason too, if you've got forced air heating or cooling, you'll want to turn that off while you're doing this so it's not sucking this dust through the whole house. And I would keep that off partially when you're doing the finishing too, because same thing, it's just going to contaminate your finish with dust. Obviously you need some heat though, but you got to find that balance. Okay, so I've done my 100 grit, which in my case is the final sanding that I'm going to do. I'm going to vacuum a little area here and we'll just have a look.
Okay, so I just vacuumed a little spot here. Basically we're ready to finish once we get everything totally cleaned up here and all the dust under control. So once you have it done and everything vacuumed up, before you finish, you want to give it a good wipe to pick up any of the fine dust and extra pieces that the vacuum didn't get. You could use a damp rag or a rag with some paint thinner on it. And just give it a bit of a wipe, the entire floor. And that will help pick up the fine dust and the most of the garbage that's left behind. And once that dries, and before I put my first coat on, I'll probably go over it with a tack cloth as well, or a cheesecloth, and that'll pick up anything else that's happened to settle in between. So, all right, so kind of our next process is we're going to clean up and we're going to start finishing this floor. Well, I'm back. Yesterday or last night we ran out of time to actually finish this floor. So I'm going to show you right now how to put the first coat on. So obviously you just watched me sand this floor and everything. I went through afterwards and vacuumed it all up really well. Then I'm using a polyurethane finish here. So I used some paint thinner on a rag and I wiped the entire floor. This helps pick up some of the finer dust and any little chunks in that. And then once that was all finished, I went over the floor again once the floor kind of dried out or evaporated. Then I used one of these tack cloths and I wiped the floor down. That just picks up any last little bits and pieces. You're always going to have something, but if the more steps you take to pick up every little piece, the less you're going to have in your finish. So if you're using a water-based paint or finish, you could just use a damp rag and wipe the floor down, but just be sure that the floor dries out before you apply your finish. So I'm using a polyurethane. Depending on what you're using, just follow your recommended instructions on the jug or can or whatever it comes in. So I'm pretty much ready here. Like I said, I've got it all ready. I got all the dust off it that I can get. I've turned the furnace we've got forced air heating here, so I've turned that off to prevent that from kicking in and blowing a bunch of dust off around, I mean. And the basic process I'm going to do is I'm going to work my way, you know, along this wall and work my way back out of the room here. And I've got some of my finish. I'll get rid of this. I've got my finish in a smaller container that's easier to pour, because I'm going to use a T-bar to apply the finish, and you'll see what that is here in a minute. And so I'm actually going to pour some onto the floor, and then I'm going to use the T-bar basically like a squeegee to manipulate that finish. But along this wall that I'm starting on, after I do the pour, I'm going to take a brush and just cut in against the wall a little bit. It's just easier to get started if I cut in with a brush. I've also got this air register here that I've got to work around right off the start, which is not a huge deal. Just a little bit about the T-bar. Maybe I'll show you that here before I get started. So the T-bar is basically a bar that you can see it in here, and this handle, and I've attached a paint handle to it, and then there's a sleeve that goes over top of it. So there's a couple different sizes that I know of. There's an 18-inch and a 24-inch. This is a 24. There's also a heavy and a lightweight. This is a new product for me. This is actually the first job I've used it on. I think if I was doing it again, I'd get the 18-inch for these smaller rooms, and I probably wouldn't get the weighted bar either. I find this one's actually a little hard to maneuver in these smaller rooms. So basically, you're just going to use it like a squeegee, and you'll see once I get going exactly how it works. Also, something to mention, you see how the end of this sleeve here is cut on a little bit of an angle on both ends? Some aren't, but it's a really good idea because it allows you to get much tighter up against walls, or if you have your baseboard still on, that sort of thing. And it applies the finish down here, but it doesn't rub along the wall or whatever you're trying to get up nice and close to. So it is nice when they're cut on a bevel like that. And I don't see why you couldn't, if your sleeve was straight, I don't see why you couldn't cut that somehow with a knife or scissors or something to put a bevel on it. So I'm just going to set that there until I get started. We did one room last night, and so I'm going to show you the first coat here, and then we're going to go to the other room and show you the second coat. And depending on your finish, you probably want to do 3. I'm going to be doing 3, but we'll just show you the first and second coats. Yeah, so just follow your manufacturer's instructions on the cans as far as coats and time in between for drying. This product that I'm using, if I recoat it in a certain amount of hours, I don't need to sand in between. But if you surpass that time limit, then you do need to sand, and that's just basically like a 220 sanding sponge. Go over the floor relatively quickly, and then use that cheesecloth or that tack cloth like I showed you before to pick up the dust, and then you can do your coat. So, okay, so we're going to get going here. I'm going to pour some finish on the floor. You want to be careful when you're doing this, doing the pouring. You know, you're going to get some dripping down the side of the jug, so you want to have something other than just this floor to set it on, so you're not leaving a ring behind. So I'm just gonna, I've actually seen some people use like a plant watering little water jug sort of thing. It's a pretty good idea. I find this works pretty good, and I can pop the lid back on it when I'm done. So I'll start here, but you'll see me in a minute. So I'm just going to take my brush and kind of cut some of this in quickly along this wall. And when I pull the T-bar along it, it'll help even it out, but it's just to get some on that surface there first. And your first coat is going to soak in pretty good. It's going to look nice and shiny when you first start. or when you first got it on, and then once it soaks in a bit, it's gonna look a little splotchy, but every coat you put on after that will get better and better. Cut in along there a little bit too. Okay. So like I said, with the T-bar, you're basically just kind of snow plowing this finish along. And it helps if you can make consistent swipes along the whole distance of the room that you're doing. Kind of pull it out, get off the excess, and do another pull. I don't quite have enough material down there. So what you're trying to do is not leave any puddles behind. With this weighted bar, I'm not really putting any pressure on it. If you have the lighter bar, you may have to. And as you run out of material, you just pour a little bit more on. Once you're getting close to the end of your room though, you want to be a little bit controlled on how much product you're putting down so that you don't get to the end of the room and then have a big mess to try to use up. Just trying to get this edge to be covered. I kind of can get so far to the one end, and I squeeze out the excess out of my brush, and then just kind of finish that off like so. Now as I'm going here, I can see I have a couple scratches that I just couldn't get sanded deep enough to get them out. And as you get down to the end of the room, it gets a little more difficult as you start to run out of space. Just a little bit more product. The weighted bar kind of helps you to not get it on as thick, but I think even if you had the light bar with a little bit of pressure, you could easily do the same thing. So again, I'm trying to be a little bit controlled about how much product I have down here till I know what it's going to take to finish the room. Okay, that's all I can do with the T-bar. I'm just going to get rid of it. And because it's a little awkward here at the end of the room, I'm just making sure I don't have any puddles there. because I couldn't squeeze out my brush anymore, or my T-bar. And I'll just finish in cutting in along the carpet here. Got a little bit of excess. That's pretty good. And I'm just looking back to any spots that might not be quite close enough to the wall. Any excess, and I realize you can't see some of that because of the camera angle, but... And yeah, we got a pretty good covering on that for our first coat, and it looks nice and shiny and glossy right now, but it will look a little more dull once it dries. This is a semi-gloss, and you'll see actually when we go to the next room what the first coat looks like when it's dry. So we'll get moved over to the other room and put a second coat on it. So here we are in another room. I first coated this last night before we left, and I'm going to do the second coat. I think I mentioned before I'm doing 3 coats total. You can see, I think you can probably see on the camera now that this is dried, how you get some glossy and some not glossy spots, and that's just from the finish soaking in. The more coats you put on, the better that's going to get and be more even. So in prepping this room for the next coat with the material I'm using, I just sanded it quickly with a sanding sponge, 220 grit I think. And then I did the tack cloth thing just to pick up the little bit of dust and that sort of stuff. So I've already kind of pre-cut in a few things here because that's pretty much the same as doing the first coat, and I'll do my pour and work my way out of the room. That's important. You want to always make sure you're working yourself to a point where you can leave the room and not be... It sounds like a simple thing, but it's easy to kind of forget about your escape plan. So same kind of thing, we're just plowing this product from one side to the other until we make our way out of the room. So I just got to get enough wet here to get started. Oops, now I stepped in my squeegee spot. It's more difficult in a small room. You don't have the room to get any kind of rhythm going. And you can see how the floor is getting nice and shiny again. So I just showed you how to refinish your hardwood floors. I've obviously got one more process to go here. Well, 2 on this floor and 1 on the other floor. One more coat to do. But really they're all basically the same. Follow your manufacturer's instructions according to the finish that you're using, as far as whether you're sanding in between or what you're doing. We'll insert some pictures at the end of the video, so stick around to see those of the finished products. So hopefully you've liked what you've seen here on houseimprovements.com, and we'd appreciate if you give us a thumbs up. Click the little icon down below. You can leave your comments below as well, or you can come and visit the forum if you have some actual questions that you need some answers for. We appreciate you watching, and we'll talk to you next time.